Hello, everyone. My name is Geoffrey Till. I am a member of the Hattendorf History Center at the US Naval War College and also Emeritus Professor in Maritime Studies at King's College London. I've been writing about navies for longer than I care to remember. Fascinating problem, an issue that has kept me content for all of my academic life. This morning, I'm going to talk about future-proofing, really, about how Thailand, as a postmodern navy, might set about facing an extremely uncertain world. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. So bear with me. Okay, Thailand and a postmodern navy, future-proofing for an uncertain future. Well, we are all in the midst of the COVID-19 outbreak, but this kind of thing has happened before. In 1348 in England, there was the Black Death, which was a truly terrible event. A third of the population was wiped out. It did huge damage to the national economy, the economy of Europe. It led to a world that seemed completely different afterwards from what it had been before. It led to domestic turmoil and international war, the near collapse of society. But of course, as far as the victims of the Black Death was concerned, this was an event that came completely unexpectedly. No preparations had been made whatsoever. But of course, pandemics are not commonplace, but they happen. 1918, 1919, the Spanish flu had a terrible effect on the world population after the First World War, but few long-term effects to a world that was already changing because of the consequences of the First World War. And as we all know, the West was relatively unprepared for COVID, unlike Asia, which did a lot better, is doing a lot better, because of its previous experience of SARS, M1, N1, and so on and so forth. My point is that these things do happen. And when they happen, they have potentially catastrophic effects. But they have to be acknowledged as part of the future that we face. Now, the business of gauging the future is something that has kept academics busy for many years. And a recent example just before the COVID outbreak was Joseph Nye, a leading American academic who surveyed the world and considered that there were a number of scenarios that might happen. And as I say, this was before COVID, just before COVID. So the Nye scenarios were, the first was what he called the collapse of the liberal order. In other words, the assumption that globalization has led to an increasingly cooperative world in which countries trade together and don't fight, and conflict and tension reduce, was likely to could well collapse. There were evident strains visible in what you might call the international system long before the COVID outbreak. Relatedly, there was the spread of authoritarianism and hyper-nationalism. In Europe, in Asia, around the world, you could see examples of real strong men taking over countries and profiting from high levels of nationalism, likely to increase the prospect of tension between states. A third option that Nye foresaw was a new world order in which China became at the center of it over time, rather than the United States or the Western world more generally. The Chinese economy was likely to pull the world out of recession and maybe deal with the consequences of COVID when it eventually happened. Another option was in response to things like this, you might have further encouragement of what he'd seen already, which was a growth of global togetherness, a willingness to cooperate with one another to deal with things like a lack of good order at sea, overfishing, pollution, climate control, international terrorism, things like that might well drive the international community together to cooperate more with each other, and indeed to become postmodern, you might say. The fifth alternative that he saw was, basically speaking, more of the same. In other words, there wouldn't be major change, that we would continue in pretty much the way we are at the moment. The conclusions that came out of the debate that followed Joseph Nye's presentation were really interesting. And just remember, this was just before the COVID outbreak. And the basic conclusion was, effectively, that we just don't know. That it could be any or all of those 5 scenarios that Joseph Nye had identified. And for my money, that's what we could well be facing. Not one of the options, but all of them, because they were all evident. You could see evidence that they were happening before the COVID outbreak. And the point was that Nye was just aiming at 2030, which is tomorrow, as far as fleet designers in the world's navies is concerned. Just 10 years later. Navies have to plan for a much more distant future than that. So if Nye was saying, we just don't know what is going to happen by 2030, how on earth can you plan a navy? How will navies, if you like, cope with a surprising future, a future that is bound to be a surprise, that's totally unpredictable? Especially since they will probably have to do more with less. In other words, they will have constrained budgets. They will have fewer resources. And this is going to aggravate the problem still further. And so what are the mix of options? Well, I would say there are 2. And these are theoretical opposites. The first, of course, this is a picture that demonstrates that the world and the world's navies are in the position of Hercules here, surrounded by the Hydra, wondering which are the heads of the Hydra that he should concentrate on. A very vulnerable position, as you can see. So there were 2 sets of ideas that occurred. The first, at one end of the range of possibilities that navies could follow, is that they should prepare for a competitive future. That they should compare, in other words, for a future of possible conflict, and that this should be their top priority. And so they would develop capabilities that were about maintaining sea control and the capacity to maneuver, the capacity to do at sea what they needed to do, whether it was to protect trade, to attack somebody else's trade, to defend the homeland, or to threaten somebody else's homeland. They might, if they were the United States or China or Russia, one of the great powers, be involved in the business of nuclear deterrence. They might have to think seriously about ballistic missile defense. They might be interested in the business of projecting power ashore and preventing somebody else from doing that against them. They might be majorly focused on exclusive maritime security. In other words, defending their resources against illegal appropriation by criminals or foreign countries coming in to take their fish or to threaten their gas and oil supplies from the sea. And they might be interested in what you might call competitive naval diplomacy, in using their navies, if you like, as a form of gunboat diplomacy, if you like, forcing other countries to do what they don't want to do. So this was at one end of the spectrum. What was at the other end of the spectrum of possibilities, the range of things that navies could prepare for, if you like, was summed up in 2007 by The American strategy, a cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power, that, as I say, appeared in 2007. It effectively outlined the tasks of the postmodern Navy, a Navy that was more about cooperation with other navies. And again, it had a kind of mirror image of those same roles, if you like. It needed sea control and the capacity to maneuver, but this was a rather different version of sea control. It was more about monitoring what was happening at sea in order to make it safe for all forms of legitimate use by all countries. It's about supervision rather than dominance of the sea. It could lead to the issue of conducting operations that were intended to stabilize the world situation. Should some event or some disaster or some local conflict or something like that occur in any part of the world system, then maybe the postmodern Navy would join with others to go and sort the problem out in some distant part of the world. So the ability to project power ashore, but of a very kind of special sort, in a cooperative fashion with other countries to resolve common problems at a distance from the homeland. Something like, for example, the conduct of the anti-piracy campaign of Somalia a few years ago. It might involve a big emphasis on humanitarian assistance and disaster response, especially in Asia, actually, where climate change seems to be creating a lot of these kind of disasters to which navies obviously needed to respond and would respond cooperating with each other to help out local communities that were threatened by landslides or typhoons or whatever. Their concept of maritime security was inclusive, not exclusive. It wasn't about keeping foreigners out. It was about joining with foreigners to deal with common problems, because after all, fish, pollution do not observe national boundaries. They are transnational problems, and they have to be resolved transnationally too. And then finally, naval diplomacy is about cooperation. It's about building friendships. It's about building trust with other nations, and providing the basis, if you like, for future cooperation. So that was a mix of options, the mix of capabilities, both competitive and cooperative, that any Navy has to think seriously about what kind of mixture of these two does it want. But on top of all that, there are huge challenges and huge opportunities presented by new technology in its various forms. And the scale of technological challenge seems to be on a greater scale than ever before, producing all kinds of possibilities, all kinds of threats, to be frank, but all basically as yet unproven, all speculative. So what are likely to be the next big things, technologically speaking? Is it autonomous systems capable of doing the dull and the dangerous? But if you're talking about combat autonomous systems that are, capable of lethal effect, killer robots, as the press likes to call them, what about the ethical issues, the legal issues involved in all of this? Is it going to be artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, things like that, making sense of an unpredictable world? On the face of it, that would seem to be a very obvious route for dealing with an unpredictable future. Is it going to be hypersonics and the capacity to produce weapon systems that are instantaneous in effect, very fast missiles and so on? Is that the future? And that, of course, will reinforce the need for speedy responses possibly responses that are too fast for the human being to cope with, and so would have to be delegated to machines. Of course, battle systems, as they tend to be called these days, are highly dependent on communications. And what about cyberspace, cyber operations? The ability to take down the operating system of a ship or of a battle system, or to defend against somebody else trying to do that. Is that going to be the top priority? And then, of course, there's space, the basis of surveillance. If you want to know what's going on, you need access to space systems of one sort or another. But that raises the possibility of, dependence on GPS and things like that. And how reliable is that going to be in the future? So against all these sorts of things, navies need to develop the power of resilience. The power effectively to go on doing what they need to do despite damage. And I think that one example of this is in fact the USS Constitution, one of their super frigates of the War of 1812. It could absorb punishment, absorb damage, without compromising its capacity to continue the mission. It was built in such a way, particularly the use of this extraordinary material, live oak, which provided its crew with great security against British cannonballs, which tended to bounce off the side. It was so stoutly built. Hence the common word nickname for the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. The crews were extremely well trained, many actually by the British. So the resilient ship and the resilient navy is capable of, first of all, avoiding damage, avoiding being caught by an unpredictable future by high levels of training, controlling it when the damage nonetheless happens so that it can go on performing its mission, and then to repair the damage that is caused. That's what resilience is, to avoid, control, and repair damage and operate as usual. So if you're designing a resilient, versatile fleet, how should you go about it? One option is to design a fleet aimed at a particular adversary, a particular country that you feel to represent at that time an approximate threat. Or you can design it to be able to deal with a particular situation that you think is most likely to happen, whether it's a weather event or conflict with a neighbor or whatever. Or more open-mindedly, you design to develop certain capabilities that you hope will come in handy, that will be useful for a range of circumstances that you can't necessarily predict. Sooner or later, that circumstance will arise, and if you have built a capability to deal with that particular circumstance, then you should be okay. One option to deal with all of those is to produce a multi-purpose balanced fleet. It's a fleet that contains a range of capabilities that gives you many options to cope. So you design for versatility, versatility represented by the mix of capabilities that your overall fleet has. One way of getting that, and it's only one way, is to design units that themselves are multi-purpose. So the multi-purpose ship, which has a range of capabilities on it, which provides you with a number of options. These are perfectly possible. I always think that the best example of a resilient and versatile military unit is actually the British Swordfish bomber, torpedo bomber. It was the only aircraft that was operational in the beginning of the Second World War in 1939 and still operational at the end of the war in 1945, because it was so extraordinarily versatile. It could do all sorts of things. Torpedo bombing, reconnaissance, even in a way act as a fighter. It was quite unique in that respect. But its uniqueness is significant because designing the multi-purpose unit is very tricky, and tends to be rather less than perfect, shall we say. There are always capabilities that you need your particular multi-purpose unit hasn't got. But anyway, the option of producing multi-purpose ships, multi-purpose platforms, rather than single-purpose ships and single-purpose platforms in a mix of platforms in the fleet, is an option. And it's an option that needs to be seriously considered. Either way, though, navies need to be what's called anti-fragile. In other words, not just resilient, but positively designed on the basis of being not fragile, being capable of withstanding damage and the unexpected demand. And many would argue that unmanned systems might be the solution. If you look at the current debate in the United States about the future fleet for 2045, you can see that most people argue that contained within that fleet, there will be a reliance on unmanned systems, which are cheap, effective, and mean that an individual platform can deliver a range of capabilities of considerable breadth, provided, of course, that the ship is designed to have the space to accommodate it, and on a basis of open architecture, which means that it can access a whole series of modularized weapon systems. But one way forwards on that is only one way, but it is a very promising way. But the perpetual hope, of course, is that the weapons, the sensors, the platforms, and all the rest of it can be acquired in a cost-effective manner. So reversing the trends by reforming acquisition. And the trend, of course, is to bigger and bigger single ships that are much more expensive and therefore fewer of them. And however good a ship or platform is, it can only be in one place at one time. So how can we actually get the kind of numbers that we need, bearing in mind how expensive naval procurement is getting these days? And one large contribution towards that might be by reforming the acquisition system, trying to make sure that that whole complicated business of designing and acquiring new naval platforms is actually conducted in the most cost-effective manner possible. But one has to say that military procurement really is an extraordinarily difficult issue to get right. And that seems to be the universal experience that navies around the world face. And then it's not just a question of designing a versatile fleet, it's how you operate it that gives you options as well, and that maintains gives you the possibility to come up with a good mix of those competitive and those cooperative roles. How do you make the best use of existing assets, what the Americans like to call programmatics, the ability of reconciling commitments and resources effectively? Very, very difficult to do, as we know the United States Navy itself is under strain in this respect, as indeed are most navies. Another option, of course, connectedly, is working with the other services. It's a form of burden sharing, not regarding the other services as competitors for budgetary processes, but as potential allies in helping deliver capabilities that may be beyond the core, beyond the possibilities of an individual service. Jointness, if you like, does seem to be the name of the game as we look around the world, although that too comes with its problems and its difficulties. Another form of burden sharing, of course, is working with allies and partners against common threats. And this makes particular sense for a postmodern Navy, which is focused on delivering maritime security in a region like Southeast Asia, for example. Something that is a high priority for the Thai Navy and for all other navies in that particular region. It is a question of burden sharing, not burden shedding. In other words, working positively with allies in order to deal with common problems like overfishing, illegal immigration, terrorism, pollution, and so on. So what are the naval requirements, if you like? Well, it seems to me that being realistic is fundamental to this. And that does mean that what I've been talking about before does mean making choices, accepting the requirements of choice, being realistic, being in a situation where you can decide to do something, even if it means that you can't do something else. You need to be able to support what you might call the direction of travel, to predict what is likely to be the most likely capability that you develop. Not necessarily to get it absolutely right, but to get the general trend right, deciding the trajectory of the post-COVID world, how to deal with what some people call the black swans, the totally unexpected, potentially catastrophic event. And there will be next times. There will be black swans appearing, which nobody predicted in the future. But I think probably the most important of these is to think holistically, is to realize that the naval element, if you like, is but one strand of the rope in what NATO calls the comprehensive approach. So there you've got the military strand, of which the Navy is one part, but it's all part of a all-of-government approach that includes law enforcement, infrastructure, information technology, social policy, economic policy, political policy, foreign policy as well. In other words, the Navy needs to be seen as part of an overall approach and integrated with the rest of national policy to deal with an uncertain future. So, having introduced all this, what is my recipe for Thailand, for future proofing, and for coping with an unexpected future? I think there are basically 6 approaches that I recommend being thought closely about, and maybe will be the theme of the conference that you're going to shortly have. So my 6 approaches. The first is what I would call sustaining the maritime approach. This means working closely with other members of what you might call the maritime team, the Coast Guards, other law enforcement agencies, industry, the maritime components of the defence industrial base, either in your country or in other countries who are reliable suppliers. The maritime section of the other services. If the Air Force can help you with surveillance over the sea, then that too is part of what you might call the maritime team. So it's distinguishing between the naval approach, which is relatively narrow, and the maritime approach, which is much greater, and making sure that the maritime background supports the Navy and that the Navy supports the maritime background, an integrating approach, if you like. Wherever I go around the world, navies tend to complain that insufficient attention is paid to their needs. So I think selling the importance of the sea is something that's pretty critical. Coping with that very common disease of sea blindness amongst the political classes in countries is very, very common. Almost every navy complains about it. Actively advocating a maritime approach, and I mean maritime, not just naval, for their country, to taking it as a positive requirement that the Navy has to perform. The third of my 6 approaches is to engage in what you might call strategic patience. In this world, there are really no quick fixes. Fleet design takes 20 years, at least, generally speaking. The more complicated the design of a particular ship, the longer the design period tends to be. But this is a long game. You need always to be looking over the horizon when developing a navy. The Chinese, for example, for some years now have been thinking about a naval future for 2049, the anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, of course. The United States have done similarly recently. We're thinking in terms of Battle Force 2045, which is really aimed at a fleet that will be fully operational in 2045. In other words, nearly 25 years away is kind of objective. It's a long game. This is not a short game. And you have to make sure that over the whole range of that future, that you're ready all the time. That you don't have so much readiness today that implies less readiness in 10 years' time. But you don't focus so much on the readiness in 10 years' time that you're not going to be ready in 20 years' time, and you might not be sufficiently ready now. So it's a question of maintaining readiness over a very long period, and that requires strategic patience. The fourth of my approaches, if you like, is identifying and resourcing clear priorities insofar as you can. When your resources don't allow you to back all the horses in the race, which generally speaking you can't do. So you do have to identify priorities. And what this really means is you do have to accept the sad necessity of choice. You do have to make decisions, which means that deciding things that you cannot do alongside things that you can. The fifth of my 6 approaches is cost-effective acquisition. As I've said, military procurement is one of the most difficult things in the world to do, but you need to keep on trying to make sure that your acquisition system, the way you design your fleet, is as efficient, as clear-sighted as possible, providing the cost-effective solution that means that the balance between commitments and resources is maintained at a reasonable level. It will be challenging. There are always challenges in this. Nobody has the perfect answer to any of this, but trying to keep your acquisition system as cost effective as possible has to be a high priority. And equally obvious, you have to manage your fleet. You have to use your fleet, to deploy your fleet in that same cost-effective manner. And again, that sounds simple, but is far from simple, because you're trying to make sure that your readiness today is not at the cost of your readiness next week, for example. It's a process that has to do with a range of possibilities, all the way from peaceful day-to-day cooperation with other fleets on things like anti-piracy patrol, all the way up to the prospect of conflict at any stage with almost anybody. And also the question of time, the sequence of events. So it may well be that the system that you have might be good at the early stages of a great power competition, for example, but no use for later stages in that same level of competition. So it's a question of balancing both the nature of what you have to do and the timing of when you have to do it compared to other things that could be done at the same time. And so the seventh of my 6 approaches, and as you might expect from me as an academic working at a Naval War College, a professor, the sort of thing that you might expect a professor to say, you have to educate your people to be smart customers, to be capable of asking defense industry the right questions, and about looking at what they offer in the most educated way, if you like, to be smart operators, to make the best use of what they've got. To do all of these things, you need to be educated, you need to be trained, and probably the investment in your people through things like having conferences and symposiums and that sort of thing is maybe the highest priority of all. If you have smart people, good things happen. If you have the best equipment in the world, but not smart people, the worst can often happen. So, after all of that, what are my conclusions? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's your problem, not mine. And I think that trying to come to conclusions about all of this is the kind of thing that your symposium will, I hope, help you decide the way forward. So thank you for your attention and good luck in your deliberations.